Zone 6, please.
David Winters from Mountain Lakes, New Jersey. With the consolidation in the insurance industry, how do you think that will affect Berkshire's insurance businesses and the long-term development of the float? And if I may, not to encourage your dogma to run over your karma, but how do you think your policy of partnership and fair dealing has enhanced or detracted from your investment returns? Thank you.
Yeah, well, the consolidation taking place in insurance has been taking place for some time. There have been some big mergers over the years. There are developments in insurance. We mentioned the super cat bonds, which are not bonds at all, but that has an effect. But I would say that there's no merger that has taken place that I regard as being detrimental either to our GEICO business or to our reinsurance business. That has not been a factor, and I think if there were some more mergers, it would not be a factor. I see no way that any entities being put together would change the competitive situation in respect to GEICO. GEICO, operating just as it does independently, is as competitive as can be, and it would not benefit by being part of any other organization. And our reinsurance business is much more opportunistic, and it's not consolidation there. It's just lack of fear generally by competitors who can price particularly cat business at a rate that could be totally inadequate, as I used in illustration in the report, but nevertheless it could appear to be profitable for a long time. And there's probably more of that going on now, and there'll probably be a lot more going on in that arena. We have some sensational insurance businesses, though. I have to tell you that I don't think you really have to worry too much about how we do in insurance in the future. We had a number of GEICO people here today. I hope you got a chance to meet them. GEICO, and you saw Lorimer Davidson. I really was hoping he could be here, but Davey is 95 years old. I went to visit him a few months ago. And it just isn't easy for him to get around, but he built a sensational company, and it stumbled once. Jack Byrne got it back on track, and Tony Nicely's got it going down the track at about 100 miles an hour, and it's getting faster all the time. So we've got a great business there. Charlie?
Nothing to add.
Zone 7?
Yes, Bill Ackman from New York. Is there a price at which it's inappropriate for a company to use its capital to buy back its stock?
Give me that again.
For example, Coca-Cola at 40 PE. Is that a smart place for Coke to deploy capital?
Well, it sounds like a very high price when you name it in terms of a PE to buy back the stock at that sort of number. But I would say this. Coca-Cola's been around 112 years now, and there are very few times in that 112 years, if any, when it would not have been smart for Coca-Cola to be repurchasing its shares. Coca-Cola is probably, in my view, among businesses that I can understand, it's the best large business in the world. I mean, it is a fantastic business, and we love it when Coke repurchases shares and our interest goes up. We owned 6.3% of Coca-Cola in 1988 when we bought in. We actually increased that a little bit a few years later. But if they had not repurchased shares, we probably would own about 6.7% or 6.8% of Coke now. As it is, we own a little over 8% through repurchases. There are going to be about 1 billion 8-ounce servings of Coke sold around the world, or Coca-Cola products sold around the world today. 8% of that is 80 million, and 6.8% is 68 million. So there are 12 million extra servings for the account of Berkshire Hathaway being sold around the world. And they're making a little over a penny a serving, so, you know, that gets me kind of excited. And I think all I can tell you is I approve of Coke repurchasing shares. I'd a lot rather have them repurchasing shares at 15 times earnings, but when I look at other ways to use capital, I still think it's a very good use of capital. And maybe the day will come when they can buy it at 20 times earnings, and if they can, I hope they go out and borrow a lot of money to buy a ton of it at those prices. And I think we will be better off 20 years from now if Coke follows a consistent repurchase approach. I do not think that is true for many companies. I mean, I think that repurchases have become in vogue and done for a lot of silly reasons. And so I don't think everybody's repurchase of shares is well reasoned at all. We see companies that issue options by the ton and then they repurchase shares much higher. I started reading about investments when I was 6, and I think the first thing that I read was, buy low, sell high. But these companies, through their options, they sell low and then they buy high, and they've got a different formula than I was taught. So there are a number that we don't approve of. But when we own stock in a wonderful business, we like the idea of repurchases even at prices that may give you nosebleeds. It generally turns out to be a pretty good policy. Charlie?
Well, I think the answer is that in any company, the stock could get to a price so high it would be foolish for the corporation to repurchase its shares.
Sure.
And you can even get into gross abuse. Before the crash, the Insul utilities were madly buying their own shares as a way of promoting the stock higher. It was like a giant Ponzi scheme at the end. So there's all kinds of excess that's possible, but the really great companies that buy at high price earnings, where that can be wise.
Our interest in Geico went from 33% to 50% without us laying out a dime, because Geico was repurchasing its shares, and we benefited substantially. But we benefited a lot more, obviously, when prices were lower. I mean, our interest in the Washington Post company has gone from 9.5% to 17.5% over the years without us buying a single share. But the Post or Coke or any number of companies don't get the bargain in repurchasing now that they used to. We still think it's probably the best use of money in many cases. Zone 8.
My name is Hutch Vernon. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. My question has to do with float. You said in the annual, and you've said in the past, that float has had a greater value to Berkshire than an equal amount of equity. And I wondered if you could clarify that statement. Is that because the float has been generated at such a low cost relative to an imputed cost for equity, or is there something else behind that statement?
No, it's because the float, which is now, we'll say, $7 billion, comes to us at a negative cost. We would not make that statement if our float was costing us a couple percent a year, even though float would then be desirable, highly desirable. But our float is even better than that, or it has been, and so it comes to us with a cost of less than zero. It comes to us with a profit attached. So if we were to get out of the insurance business and give up the $7 billion of float and replace it with $7 billion of equity, we would have less going for us next year than under the present situation, even though our net worth would appear to be $7 billion higher. And I have said that if we were to make the decision, if we were offered the opportunity to go out of the insurance business, and that $7 billion liability would, as part of that decision, would evaporate from our balance sheet, so that our equity would go up $7 billion with no tax implications, we would turn down that proposition. So obviously we think that $7 billion, which is shown as a liability, when it's viewed as part of an insurance business, is not a liability at all in terms of real economic value. And of course, the key is not what the float is today, and not what the cost is today. The key is what is the float going to be 10 or 15 years from now, and what is the cost going to be 10 or 15 years ago. And we will work very hard at both increasing the amount of float and keeping the cost down somewhere close to our present level. That makes it a very attractive business when that can be done. And GEICO's a big part of of doing that, but we've got other things, other insurance operations that'll be important in that too, and we may have others besides that in the future. Charlie?
Yeah, if the float keeps growing, that is a wonderful thing indeed. We really have a marvelous insurance business. In addition to having this remarkable earning power, it's way less likely to get really clobbered than most insurance businesses. So I think it's safer on the downside and has a better upside.
And it may sound strange, but we don't regard losing $1 billion in the California quake as getting really clobbered. I mean, that's part of the game. There are many companies that have greater exposures than that really aren't getting paid for it. And you don't see it specifically, but any company that has a ton of homeowners business in Florida or Long Island or along the coast of Texas may have exposures many times our billion, and really exposures many times our billion, and really not be getting paid appropriately or specific. Zone 9.
Hi, my name is Mary Semler from Seattle, Washington. Japan is a major holder of U.S. treasuries. Given the troubled Japanese economy, do you foresee Japan cashing in their U.S. investments to bail themselves out? Why or why not?
Sorry, I didn't get all that.
I didn't get that either.
I was busy chewing here, and but
Japan is a major holder of U.S. treasuries. Given the troubled Japanese economy, do you foresee Japan cashing in their U.S. investments to bail themselves out? Why or why not?
The problems with the Japanese economy, and does that mean that are you thinking particularly about them dumping treasuries or something of the sort?
That's exactly what she's...
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. All the questions about what so-called foreigners do with investments. Let's just assume the Japanese or any other country decides to sell some U.S. government holdings that they have. If they sell them to U.S. corporations or citizens or anything, what do they receive in exchange? They receive U.S. dollars. What do they do with the U.S. dollars? They can't get out of the system. If they sell them to the French, the French give them something in return. Now the French own the government securities. But really, as long as we, the United States, run a deficit, a big deficit, a trade deficit, we are accepting goods and giving something in exchange to foreigners. I mean, when they send us whatever that it may be, and on balance they send us more of that than we send over there, we give them something in exchange. We may give them an IOU, we may give them a government bond, but we may give them an investment they make in the United States. But they have to be net investors in this country as long as we're net consumers of their goods. It's a tautology. So I don't even know quite how a foreign government dumps its government bonds without getting some other type of asset in exchange that may have an effect on a different market. The one question you always want to ask in economics is, and not a bad idea elsewhere too, but is, and then what? Because there's always a second side to a transaction. And just ask yourself, if you are a Japanese bank and you sell $1 billion worth of government bonds, U.S. government bonds, what do you receive in exchange? And what do you do with it? And if you follow that through, I don't think you'll be worried about foreign governments selling U.S. bonds. It is not a threat. Charlie?
If I owned Japan, I would want a large holding of U.S. treasuries. You're on an island nation without much in the way of national resources. I think their policy is quite intelligent for Japan, and I'd be very surprised if they dumped all their treasuries.
If they're a net exporter to us, though, what choice do they have? I mean, think about it. If they send over more goods to us than we send to them, which has been the case, they have to get something in exchange. Now, for a while, they were taking movie studios in exchange. You know? They were taking New York real estate in exchange. I mean, they've got a choice of assets, but they don't have a choice as to whether, if they can send us more than they get from us, whether they get some investment asset in return. I mean, it's amazing to me how little discussion there is of that, the fact that there's two sides to an equation. But it makes for better headlines when read the other way. Zone 10.
This is John Vaughn from Detroit, Michigan. Nebraska's Senator Kerry has proposed private investment accounts for up to 2 percentage points of the current payroll tax. His words were, and I quote, "People want more than just a transfer payment, they want wealth." Do you approve this proposal? And if you do, would you recommend passive investing, i.e. index? Or if you recommend active investing, would you and Charlie want to give it a shot?
Well, I've talked with Bob Kerry about that, and Bob does like the idea of giving everybody some piece of the American economy and an interest in it. He's thought, as you know, he's proposed really sort of small grants to the 3.5 million or so children born every year, and then some buildup of that account. Senator Moynihan has come up with something recently in conjunction with Kerry. I personally would not like to see any major amount of Social Security, and Moynihan is talking about 2%, and I suggested the idea that maybe 2% out of the 12 and a fraction percent at the option of the beneficiary, Social Security participant, could be devoted to some other system, but then they would only get 5/6 of the basic Social Security benefit. I don't think you could drop it below that, because you wouldn't want people turning 65 or maybe more advanced age in the future, 70, and not having the safety net of Social Security. So I wouldn't want to drop it below about 5/6 of the present benefits. I think it's a perfectly reasonable topic to discuss whether you want to take that 2% then and let people build up an account, perhaps tax-free, perhaps an IRA type account, so they would have both wealth and the safety net. But I wouldn't want to drop the safety net very, very far. And I think that I would not want to turn an army of salespeople loose on the American public with a mandatory 2% going in some direction. I don't think that would be particularly healthy. Charlie?
I'm much less enthusiastic than you are. In other words, your negative or conservative attitude is way more affirmative than mine. I think the idea of getting the government into promoting the value of equities. In Japan, we have a taste of that now. The Japanese government has been using the postal savings system to buy equities massively year after year after year. I don't think we need to get the government into the equity market.
We go to zone 11, please.
I'm Dale Max from University Park, Illinois, and I've got a question for each of you, a short question for Charlie, and maybe a little longer for Warren. My question for Charlie is, in a business school sense, what is the cost of capital for Berkshire Hathaway? And my question for Warren is that I've been on the internet and I look at Yahoo and they give you recommendations for companies, and when I search for Berkshire Hathaway, it shows that nobody is recommending Berkshire Hathaway, despite the fact that there are maybe 1,000 people that are wearing signs here, "I love Berkshire Hathaway," and of course I've got mine on too, but what seems to be the problem in lack of recommendations?
Well, we're not recommending Yahoo, incidentally, either, but but I'll let puzzle people for thousands of years, and then
the way that is taught in most business schools now, I find incoherent, and so I'm the one that asks that question and gets the incoherent answers. I don't have a good answer to a question I consider kind of a stupid question. What is the cost of capital at Berkshire Hathaway when we keep drowning in this torrent of cash?
To get to that, but you don't need a mathematical answer. The first question is when you have capital, is it better to keep it or return it to shareholders? It's better to return it to shareholders when you cannot create more than $1 of value with that capital. That's test number one. And if you pass that threshold that you think you can achieve more than $1 of value for every dollar retained, then you simply look around for the thing that you feel the surest about and that promises the greatest return, weighted for that certainty. So our cost of capital is, in effect, is measured by the ability to create more than $1 of value for every dollar retained. If we're keeping dollar bills that are worth more in your hands than in our hands, then we've exceeded the cost of capital as far as I'm concerned. And once we think we can do that, then the question is how do we do it to the best of our ability? And frankly, all of the stuff I see in business schools, and I've not found any way to improve on that formula. Now, the trouble that you may have is that many managements would be reluctant to distribute money to shareholders, even if they would rationalize that they would do better than they then actually do. But that may be a danger on it, but that won't be solved by them hiring a bunch of people to come up with some cost of capital that also justifies them keeping the money, because that's what they'll do otherwise. The question about recommending the stock, we've very seldom had stock recommendations over the years. As I think back to 1965, I can't think of a lot of brokerage reports that have recommended Berkshire. I'm not looking for any, reports at all. We are not looking to have Berkshire sell at the highest possible price, and we're not looking to try and attract people to Berkshire who are buying stocks because somebody else recommends them to them. We prefer people who figure out for themselves why they themselves want to buy Berkshire, because they're much more likely to stick around if they enter the restaurant because they decide it's the restaurant they want to eat at than if somebody has touted them on it. And that's our approach. So we do nothing to encourage, but I think even if we did, we probably wouldn't generate a lot of recommendations. It's not a great stock to get rich on if you're a broker.
Yeah, I think the reason. I think one of the main reasons why it's so little recommended in the institutional market is that it's perceived as hard to buy in quantity.
We prefer, we've got some good institutions as holders, including one that's run by a very good friend of ours, but frankly it's more fun for us to have a bunch of individual shareholders. I mean, you see it translates, if there's money made, it translates into changes in people's lives and not some change in somebody's performance figure for one quarter. And we think that individuals are much more likely to join us with the idea of staying with us for as long as we stay around. And that's the way we look at the business. Very few institutions look at investments that way, and frankly, we think they're often less rational holders than we get with individuals. Number one.
Good morning. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Hugh Stevenson, a shareholder from Atlanta. My question involves the company's SuperCat reinsurance business. You've addressed some of this, but I would like for you to expound on it, please. You've indicated that you think this is the most important business of the company. And my question is what you think the long-term impact of catastrophe bonds and catastrophe derivatives will be on the float and the growth in float of the company affect the way you price your business. But I'm wondering how you think it can affect the volume of the business. And I remember several years ago, Mr. Buffett, you talk about you can never be smarter than your dumbest competitor.
Right.
And these are some potentially dumb competitors.
You've got it. I just want to put an asterisk on one thing. We say insurance will be our most important business. We've not said the Super Cat business will be our most important. Super Cat has been a significant part of our business and may well over the years remain a significant part, but it is far less significant than Geico, and I'll mention a word or two about that. But the Super Cat business, you can price wrong, as I illustrated in my report. You can be pricing it at half what it should be priced at. I used an illustration in the report of how you could misprice it, a policy that you should be getting, say, $1.5 million for, namely a $50 million policy on writing on something that had one chance in 36 of happening. So you should get almost $1.5 million for it. I said if you priced it at $1 million a year, you would think you were making money after 10 years, 70-odd% of the time. The interesting thing about that is if you priced it for $1 a year, you would have thought you made money 70-odd% of the time, because when you are selling insurance against very infrequent events, you can totally misprice them but not know about it for a long time. Super Cat bonds open up that field wide open. I mean, you've always had the problem of dumb competitors, but you have a much more chance of having dumb competitors when you have a whole bunch of people who, in the case of hedge funds who have bought some of these, where the manager gets 20% of the profits in the year when there are profits and there is no hurricane, and when there happens to be a hurricane or an earthquake, he doesn't take the loss as limited partners do. So it's very likely to be a competitive factor that brings our volume down a lot. It won't change our prices. The thing to remember is the earthquake does not know the premium that you receive. I mean, the earthquake happens regardless. So it doesn't say, you don't have somebody out there on the San Andreas Faults that says, well, he only charged a 1% premium, so we're only going to do this once every 100 years. It doesn't work that way. So we will probably do a whole lot less volume in the next few years in the Super Cat business. We have these two policies that run for a couple of more years. But in terms of new business, we will do a whole lot less. Geico is by far the most important part of our insurance business, though. Geico in the 12 months ended April 30th had a 16.9% increase in policies in force. Year end, I told you it was 16.0. A year ago, I told you it was 10. The year before that, I think it was 6 and a fraction. So its growth is accelerating, and it should be in a whole lot more homes around the country than it is now, by a big factor, and it will be, in my view. So that will be the big part of our insurance business. But we may be in the insurance business in some other ways too, as time goes along. It's a business that, if you exercise discipline, you should find some ways to make money, but it won't always be the same way. Charlie?
I've got nothing to add.
Okay, zone 2.
Hello, I'm Steve Davis from San Francisco. I'd like your advice on how to understand annual reports, what you look for, what's important, what's not important, and what you've learned over the years from reading thousands of reports. Thank you.
Well, we've read a lot of reports, I will tell you that. And we start by looking at the reports of companies that we think we can understand. So we hope to be reading reports, and I do read hundreds of them every year. We hope to be reading reports of businesses that are understandable to us. And then we see from that report whether the management is telling us about the things that we would want to know about if we owned 100% of the company. And when we find a management that does tell us about those things and that is candid in the same way that a manager of a subsidiary would be candid with us and talks in language that we can understand, it definitely improves our feeling about investing in such a business, it definitely improves our feeling about investing in such a business, and the reverse turns us off to some extent. So if we read a bunch of public relations gobbledygook, it has some effect toward a business. We want to understand the business better when we get through with the annual report than when we picked it up. And that is not difficult for a management to do if they want to do it. If they don't want to do it, we think that is a factor in whether we want to be their partners over a 10-year period or so. But we've learned a lot from annual reports. For example, I would say that the Coca-Cola annual report over the last good many years has been an enormously informative document. I mean, I can't think of any way if I had had a conversation with Roberto Goizueta or now Doug Ivester, and they were telling me about the business, they would not be telling me more than I get from reading that annual report. We bought that stock based on an annual report. We did not buy it based on any conversation of any kind with the top management of Coca-Cola before we bought our interest. We simply bought it based on reading the annual report, plus our knowledge of how the business worked. Charlie?
Yeah, I do think if you've got a standardized bunch of popular jargon that looks like it came out of the same consulting firm, I do think it's a big turnoff. That's not to say that some of the consulting mantras aren't right, but I think there's a lot for sort of candid, simple, coherent prose. A lot to be said for it.
Almost every business has problems, and we just assume the manager would tell us about them. We would like that in the businesses we run. In fact, one of the things, we give very little advice to our managers, but one thing we always do say is to tell us the bad news immediately, and I don't see why that isn't good advice for the manager of a public company. Over time, I'm positive it's the best. I'm positive it's the best policy, but a lot of companies, they're dying just to pump out what they think is good news all the time, and they have this attitude that that you've got a bunch of animals out there to be fed, and that they're going to feed them what they want to eat all the time. And over time, the animals learn. So we try and stay away from businesses like that.
What you seldom see in an annual report is a sentence like this: "This is a very serious problem, and we haven't quite figured out yet how to handle it." But believe me, that is an accurate statement much of the time. All right, zone 3.
I'm Larry Dirks, and I live in the area, and I would like to know what your prediction is for Coca-Cola's long-term growth versus Pepsi-Cola's recent efforts to increase their competitiveness with Coke.
Yeah. Long term, I would expect Coke to continue to gain versus Pepsi.
What has he been doing while I was gone? What'd you say, Charlie? I knew I was taking a chance. What was the question?
I said that long term I expected Coke to continue to gain versus Pepsi.
Oh, well, it's those kind of insights is why we keep him on the job year after year. In a moment of particular confidence, he one time told me the same thing about RC. Now, that was probably zone 3 you were answering, so we'll go to 4. What have you got there? You got peanut brittle? Mm-hmm. Zone 4, please.
Jason, Houston, Texas. My first question's on the quality of earnings and your evaluation of quality of earnings in the U.S. right now. And the second is what multiples should be put on asset gains, such as sale of bottling assets or reversal of merger reserves. Thanks.
Yeah, well, taking the second question, for example, at Coca-Cola, where the bottling transactions are incidental to a long-term strategy which, in my view, has been enormously successful to date and which has more successes ahead of it. But in the process of rearranging and consolidating the bottling system and expanding to relatively undeveloped markets, there have been and there will be a lot of bottling transactions. And Some produce large gains, some produce small gains. I ignore those in my evaluation of Coke. The two important elements in Coke are unit case sales and shares outstanding. And if the shares outstanding go down and the unit case sales advance at a good clip, you are going to make money over time in Coca-Cola. There have been transactions where people have purchased rights to various drinks. Coca-Cola's purchased some of those around the world. And when you see what is paid for 1 million or 100 million unit cases of business, and then you think to yourself that maybe Coke will add 1.5 billion cases a year, that's a real gain in value. It's a dramatic gain in value, and that is what counts in terms of the Coca-Cola company. If you think the Coca-Cola company is going to sell some multiples of its present volume 15 or 20 years from now, and you think there'll be a lot fewer shares outstanding, you've gone about as far as you need to go. But I would pay no attention to asset gains. I would just take those out of the picture. Now, as to quality of earnings, Charlie and I feel that in several respects, but in one important respect, that the quality of earnings has gone down, not because the policy has changed, but because it's just become more significant, and that's in the case of stock options. There are certain companies that we've evaluated for possible purchase where in our calculation of earnings, the earnings are maybe 10% less per year, per share, than reported. And that isn't necessarily the end of the world, but it is a difference in valuation that is significant and is not reported under standard accounting. So we think the quality of earnings as reported by a company with significant stock option grants every year, we think is dramatically poorer than one where that doesn't exist. And there are a lot of companies that fall in that category. Coca-Cola's earnings are very easy to figure it out. Just figure out what they're earning per case from operations, and you'll see over the years the earnings per case go up, and the cases go up, and the shares go down. And it doesn't get much more complicated than that. Charlie?
You've said it wonderfully. I just wish we had more like that.
Yeah. GEICO, the key, the same way as policies in force and underwriting experience per policy. And that is exactly the way, as noted in the annual report, we pay people there. We pay them from the bottom to the very top based on what happens with those two variables. And we don't talk about earnings per share at GEICO, and we don't talk about investment income. We don't get off the track, because there are two things that are going to determine what kind of business that GEICO is over a long period of time. And policies at GEICO are unit cases at Coca-Cola. Zone 5.
Hello, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is James Claus from New York City, and I just wanted to ask you a question. Both you and Mr. Munger have repeatedly said that you don't believe that business valuation is being taught correctly at our universities. And as a PhD student at Columbia Business School, that troubles me understandably, because in a couple of years I'll be joining the ranks of those teaching business valuation. My question isn't what sources such as Graham or Fisher or Mr. Munger's talks you would point people that are teaching business valuation to, but do you have any counsel about the techniques of teaching business valuation?
Well, I was lucky. I had a sensational teacher in Ben Graham, and we had a course there. There's at least one fellow out in the audience here that attended with me, and just Ben made it terribly interesting, because what we did was we walked into that class and we valued companies, and he had various little games he would play with us. Sometimes he would have us evaluate company A and company B with a whole bunch of figures, and then we would find out that A and B were the same company at different points in its history, for example. And there were a lot of little games he played to get us to think about what were the key variables, and how could we go off the track. I remember one time Ben met with Charlie and me and about 9 or so other people down in San Diego in 1968 or so, and he gave all of us a little true-false test, and we all thought we were pretty smart, and we all flunked. But that was his way of teaching us that a smart man playing his own game and working at fooling you could do a pretty good job at it. But I would, if I were teaching a course on investments, there would be simply one valuation study after another with the students trying to identify the key variables in that particular business and evaluating how predictable they were first, because that is the first step. If something is not very predictable, forget it. You don't have to be right about every company. You have to make a few good decisions in your lifetime. But then when you find, the important thing is to know when you find one where you really do know the key variables, which ones are important, and you do think you've got a fix on them. Where we've done well, Charlie and I made a dozen or so very big decisions relative to net worth, but not as big as they should have been. And we've known we were right based on those going in. I mean, they just weren't that complicated, and we knew we were focusing on the right variables and that they were dominant. And we knew that even though we couldn't take it out to 5 decimal places or anything like that, we knew that in a general way we were right about them. And that's what we look for, the fat pitch. And that's what I would be trying to teach students to do. And I would not try to teach them to think they could do the impossible. Charlie?
Yes, if you're planning to teach business valuation, and what you hope to do is teach the way people teach real estate appraising. So you can take any company, and your students, after studying your course, will be able to give you an appraisal of that company, which will indicate really its future prospects compared to its market price. I think you're attempting the impossible.
Yeah, probably on the final exam, I would take an internet company, and I would say the final exam, the question is, how much is this worth? And anybody that gave me an answer, I would flunk.
Right.
Make grading papers easy, too. Okay, Zone 6.
Good morning, Lawrence Balter, Carlsbad, California. Question for the two of you. There was an article, I think about last year in the New York Times that regarded Wesco as a Berkshire Class C share type company. And I'd like to know your comments on that. And the second question is, if I were to write you a check for the operating businesses that Berkshire owns, how much would it have to be?
Big. Charlie is the resident expert on Wesco, so I'm going to let him address that subject. He gets very eloquent on this.
Yeah, we always say that per unit of book value, Wesco is worth way less than Berkshire, and indeed the market is saying the same thing. It is not a clone of Berkshire. It's a historical accident.
We want to do well, obviously, for Wesco. We own 80% of it, and we've got strong feelings about the people who are partners there, particularly the Peters family, who, in effect, invited us in 20-odd years ago and trusted us to manage a big part of their money, in effect, by letting us buy control. So we've got strong fiduciary feelings about it. It suffers in comparison with Berkshire because, for one thing, anybody that wants a tax-free merger is going to want to come to Berkshire. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. And we are looking for big ideas primarily, and the big ideas are going to fit into Berkshire. We would love to get ideas that fit into Wesco, and we had a very good one a couple of years ago, thanks to Roy Dinsdale pointing me in the right direction. And we added Kansas Bankers Surety to Wesco, and it's a gem, and it's run by Don Toll, who's done a terrific job. But that's the exception, unfortunately, because if a flight safety comes along, it's not going to fit Wesco. So we will do our best for Wesco, but the nature of things is that most of the opportunities that make a lot of sense are going to come to Berkshire. Charlie, do you have anything?
Nothing more.
Okay, Zone 7.
My name is Bob Swanson from Phoenix, and I'm wondering what are the advantages of investing in Berkshire Hathaway as opposed to investing in the stocks that Berkshire owns?
Well, a lot of people do one or the other, and some people do both, but you have to really make up your own mind on that. We're not going to go to great lengths to tell you about everything that Berkshire is doing as we go along, and there could be some changes, and there will be things that can happen in Berkshire that I think you would have trouble duplicating elsewhere. But on the other hand, if you'd put all your money in Coca-Cola some years back, you might have done better than if you put it in Berkshire. So we really make no recommendation to what people do with their money. We do not seek to become investment advisors through, in effect, our portfolio actions at Berkshire. Charlie?
Basically, we hate it when people follow us around buying what we buy.
Nothing personal.
No. By the way, the questioner before this last one asked, what is the market value under the hammer of all Berkshire's operating subsidiaries? And the answer is, you have to figure that out yourself.
Mr. Nice Guy. But we give you the information, incidentally, where your judgment on that should be about as good as ours. There's nothing mysterious about valuing the Buffalo News or See's Candy or Flight Safety or Dairy Queen. So you really have the same information we have in that. I mean, if there's material information that we aren't giving you about any important Berkshire subsidiary, we'd like to give it to you because we think you are entitled to have the information that enables you to value the various pieces. Because of the aggregate size of Berkshire now in terms of market capitalization and some of the positions we own, the smaller subsidiaries really cannot have that much effect. We love them just as much. I enjoy all of the businesses we're in, and I enjoy the people that run them. So we don't we don't differentiate in our attitude within the company, but in terms of the actual impact on the valuation of Berkshire, there are a number that really they just don't make that much difference in terms of figuring out whether Berkshire's worth X or X minus 1,000 or plus 1,000, because 1,000 now is over $1 billion in terms of valuation. $1 billion is still a lot of money. Area 8, please.
Hello, Mr. Buffett, Mr. Munger. My name is Robert McCormick. I'm from Holdridge, Nebraska, and I would like to know how much you attribute the gains enjoyed by the stock market these past years to the baby boomer generation investing for their retirement.
Yeah, I would say that personally I would not think that has much to do with it. I think the two big factors there's three big factors. One is the improved return on equity, which was a fundamental factor that pushed stock prices up. Two is the decline in interest rates that pushed stock prices up. And then finally, stock prices advancing themselves brings in buying. It doesn't go on forever, but it creates its own momentum to some extent if you have these underlying factors that started to push it along. So I would say two of the three factors are fundamental, and the third is a market-type factor that bull markets do feed on themselves. And I think that you've seen some evidence of that. But I don't think that any specific, the 401k factor or whatever it may be was it by itself. But I do think money is pouring into mutual funds, for example, because people have had a very favorable experience with those funds, and that does bring investors along. People want to be on the train. Charlie? And I think, incidentally, many of them have very unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, the general investment experience in the last, 18 years in common stocks has been awesomely high, I think, by any past standards now. Isn't that right, Warren?
Right. Well, you've had, since 1982, you've had roughly tenfold in the Dow and probably similar in the S&P. And with a huge amount of money and with more participants all the time. And there are people coming into the market every day because they feel that they've missed the boat, or they're coming in heavier than they came in before simply because they've had a pleasant experience. And past experience does not mean much in terms of what you should expect from your investments. You will do well in your investments because you own or bought things at the right price and the businesses behaved well from that point forward.
Well, you won't have 18 more years at 17 or 18% per annum. That I think we can virtually guarantee.
Area 9.
Hello. I'm Tubby Stamen from Palm Beach, Florida. I know you enjoy bridge very much. I know you play my late husband's convention. Tell me, how often are you able to devote to this wonderful game? How many times a week do you play other than the internet?
I didn't get all of that, Charlie.
How much bridge are you playing?
Uh-oh.
Yes.
Well, we should put this in the annual report because it may be a material factor. I'm probably at least 10 hours a week, maybe a little more. I don't get any better by doing it either. It's rather discouraging, but it is a lot of fun, and it has to have come out of reading time. I don't think it's hurt Berkshire yet, but that may be because we're in a slow period generally. If the market goes down a lot, I promise to cut back on my bridge. Charlie?
Yeah. Well, I probably play 3 or 4 hours a week, but I don't play on the internet.
He plays a lot of golf, though. I confess, Charlie.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we both spend about the same amount of time goofing off. I mean, if you want to know. Okay, Area 10.
Yes, my name is Carrie Blecker, also from West Palm Beach, Florida. With all due respect to Mr. Eisner, if he's in the audience, there's been some criticism levied recently at the Disney company, mainly from an accounting professor at one of the state universities in New York, in reference to Disney's purchase of capital cities and the way they accounted for that purchase. Basically, what this professor is saying is that Disney somehow created a slush fund and is charging the expenses to the merger to this slush fund rather than earnings. If you're familiar with this criticism, I'm wondering what you think of it. If you're not, are you familiar with the way Disney accounted for the purchase of capital cities?
Yeah, I am familiar.
Thank you.
And actually, Abe Brilloff, who wrote that, is a fellow who in general I admire. Abe wrote me a letter where he teaches, and I wrote him back, and I told him I wouldn't be able to do it because it's not in proximity to where I'll be. And I told him, and he asked me about the Disney thing, and I told him I disagreed with him on certain. I admire what Abe does in the attempt to have accounting reflect economic reality, but he and I don't see it exactly the same on some points, although we would agree on other points. I don't think Disney is a very complicated enterprise to evaluate. I mean, when Cap Cities bought ABC, there were purchase accounting adjustments, and they tend to wash through to some extent. I mean, if you have programs that you're stuck on, you may write those down from what the previous carrying cost was. Maybe the previous management should have written them down too at that point. But I don't think that. I think with Disney, what you see now is what you get. Charlie?
Yeah, I've got no great quarrel with the accounting at Disney. I think Brilloff is a wonderful guy. He's got a good sense of humor, and he generally fights the right demons, but I don't think you can criticize Disney's accounting.
We certainly disagree with Abe, who, like I say, I agree with Charlie. He's a good guy, but we disagree with him on amortization of intangibles entirely. So we would say that if Disney is charging whatever it may be, probably $400 million a year for amortization of intangibles, which is not tax deductible, we would include that as a component of earnings. So there might be some pluses and minuses that you would make an adjustments. But I would say by the time you had back amortization of intangibles, that we would probably think the economic earnings of Disney might well be more than the reported earnings in the next few years. I think that the intangible amortization question, which the FASB is looking at now, I think it should be changed. I mean, I think it absolutely distorts economic reality, and I think that it influences whether people go to purchaser accounting or pooling, and they do all kinds of acrobatics to try and get pooling accounting. And it shouldn't make that kind of difference in reported numbers based on whether a transaction which has exactly the same economics is done through a purchaser pooling. But I have seen managements, some I know quite well, arrange to do things on a pooling basis that they think if they were private, they would do it on a purchase basis. And I think that's nuts. And I think if accounting is pushing people to doing things that are nuts, that it's time for accounting to look at accounting to look at itself. I would say that net the economic earnings of Disney, in our view, are somewhat higher than reported earnings. Zone 11, please.
Good morning, Mr. Munger and Mr. Buffett. My name is Prakash Puram from Minneapolis. There seem to be great values in the technology sector that meet most of your criteria, philosophy in investing, with the exception of the simplicity criterion. Names like IBM, Microsoft, HP, Intel. Would you ever consider investing in companies in this sector in the future?
Well, the answer is no, and it's probably pretty unfortunate because I've been an admirer of Andy Grove and Bill Gates, and I wish I translated an admirer of Andy Grove and Bill Gates, and I wish I translated that admiration. And I don't know what that world will look like in 10 years, and I don't want to play in a game where I think the other guys have got an advantage over me, and I could spend all my time thinking about tech. I wouldn't be the 100th or the 1,000th or the 10,000th smartest guy in the country in looking at those businesses. So that is a 7 or 8 foot bar that I can't clear. There are people that can clear it, but I can't clear it, and no matter how I train, I can't clear it. So the fact that there will be a lot of money made by somebody doesn't bother me really. And I mean, there may be a lot of money made by somebody in cocoa beans, but I don't know anything about them. And there are a whole lot of areas I don't know anything about. So, more power to them. And I think it would be a very valid criticism if Charlie and I, if it were possible that Charlie and I, and by spending a year working on it, could become well enough informed so that our judgment would be better than other people's. But that wouldn't happen, and it would be a waste of time. It's much better for us to swing at the easy pitches. Charlie?
Whatever you think you know about technology, I think I know less.
That's probably not true, incidentally. Charlie has a little more of a... He understands some things in the physical world a lot better than I do. But anyway, we'll go to Zone 1.
Good morning. I'm Murray Cass from Markham, Ontario. First off, against my dentist's advice, I'd like to thank you for the free Coke and ice cream last night. Earlier this morning, Mr. Buffett, you mentioned that you liked when wonderful companies like Coke purchased their shares back. Similarly, I own shares in a wonderful company, that's Berkshire. Should I be hoping that you buy your own shares back?
Well, it's interesting. We should have, perhaps we should have bought some shares back, but usually at the time we could have bought something else that also did very well for us. I mean, maybe when we were buying Coke, we could have been buying our own shares back. To some extent, there hasn't been that much trading in them, but I think it's a valid criticism to say that we have missed the boat at various times in not repurchasing shares. We'll see what we do in the future on that. If it looks like the best thing to do with money, it's what we should be doing. And in the past, I've probably been not optimistic enough in respect to Berkshire compared to other things we were doing with money. Now, the money we spent buying the Geicos and all of that has turned out to be a good use of money, too. But we've never wanted to leverage up. That's just not our game. So we've never wanted to borrow a lot of money to repurchase shares. we might advise other people to do it, but it's not our style ourselves. We've got all our money in the company. We've got all of our friends and our relatives' money virtually. So we have never felt that we wanted to leverage up this company like it was just one of a portfolio of 100 stocks. But it's a valid criticism to say that we have not repurchased shares when we should have. And it's also a valid criticism to say that we've issued some shares we shouldn't have issued. Charlie?
Well, I would agree with both comments.